1994 in line with the interim constitution and in line with the policies that were being developed in those first 2 years and all. And this was based, in the instance of the ANC, we had a ready-to-govern document.
Yes.
We also had the Reconstruction and Development Program. And the Reconstruction and Development Program was very clear on what the social safety net should look like. And we were clear that we were going to change that. And we started by ensuring equity in grants payments, and that's pensions, disability, etc.
Yeah.
We also looked at the state maintenance grant, which was a grant for children in indigent communities. And that grant was only for white, Indian, coloured children. It did not reach African children. And we drew up a policy document, and this was, the work was commissioned and done by, the work was commissioned by the department, and at that point the Director General was Dr. Leila Patel, outstanding in this area. Worked with a number of academics and people, progressive, part of the movement, Vivian Taylor and various others, and a white paper was developed. But before the white paper, Francie Lunt prepared a paper to look at how we would transition from a state maintenance grant to a child support grant. And this was difficult, because transitioning, we had to look at the budget and what was the budget that was available. And as we looked at extending the grant to the lowest 20% quintile of the poorest in the country, we had to see how we would transition this. And there were a number of angry meetings in communities who were recipients of the state maintenance grant, who were reluctant to look at the base expanding. And, with the whole issue, debating in cabinet of how much is it going to cost and who's going to pay it was a difficult issue. So we transitioned kids off the grant at a certain age, but we did it gradually and we brought on others. But this grant, the child support grant, was to be accompanied by a basket of services. Access to education, which was there. We also said every mother of a child on a child support grant had to produce the Road to Health card. So that would ensure, and I shouldn't just say mother, every caregiver, because in instances it was a caregiver. And that Road to Health card and producing it at the payment point would show that there's more that's going into it. We also looked at both expanded public works program, but also a project that we had started working on that was a flagship program, and this was called a program dealing with the war on poverty, because we saw this as part of our war on poverty. And here we provided training, skills training and grants to caregivers in order that they would become small entrepreneurs. We also hope that even with that small as the grant was at that point in time, that it would bring the caregivers into co-ops. And they would do group buying and all. But I must tell you, the grant expanded fast. The war on poverty flagship programs were expanded across the country. And there were some exceptional flagships out in the Northern Cape on agriculture and food security. There were different ones. There was a project out in Fraserburg in the Cape. Again, I think it was agricultural related. And we had different projects in different parts of the country. But it wasn't sustained and necessarily expanded to the extent required. So I'm just pointing to the fact that many people say this grant created dependency. It was never the intention. It was to give a lift to those households that had access to little or nothing. And there were many, you know. And it was to be linked with other government departments. And as I say, Department of Education, the Department of Health. The Department of Public Works. And we even involved some of the economic departments and said, you must come in and take it forward. Department of Labour worked with them on their skills programs and so on to take it forward. So it was government working in synergy. But you know, coordination across government is not easy. And we were sort of, let's call it pioneers, breaking ground to make it happen. And fortunately, we had the cabinet committees and subcommittees, but we also look towards, and this is where I moved over to public service. How do you incentivize public servants when there are projects that are led across departments? We also try to ensure that you could, for example, have a program, a project manager that may not necessarily be the most senior in a department, but this project manager must be able to lead integrated teams. But it takes hard work, and when things break down, then it's easier to get rid of these because, you know, development is not easy. And development is long-term. Development requires vision and resilience. So to make a difference, it's not a short-term, or as Professor Adebayo Adedeji said, when he oversaw the African peer review mechanism process for South Africa, he said it's not a shot in the arm. And anyone who thinks there's a quick fix, don't believe them.
So what many people can tell you that ANC policies, for instance, are fantastic. I think many people in this country will agree. It's exactly that. Implementing these policies becomes quite challenging. You've just given us an example of the fact that, you know, when you speak to what ANC's vision is, we have many plans actually in place. This government has many, many plans, but we don't seem to follow through.
It's not always been the case. I mean, let me give you one large infrastructure project as a point in case. Look at the Gautrain. That was a huge project. And it was seen through. And in the beginning, lots of moans and groans, too expensive and all. Look at the numbers of people who use that. And we should look at how we extend that. There's also been, let me think of another. Let's talk about institution building. So look at the South African Revenue Services. It's really building an institution that's quite resilient. There were attempts to break it down, but it persevered because of the resilience of the institution. Take into account the fact that in Gauteng, there was no administration. It was set up from scratch. And you had set up treasuries at a provincial level. You had JEDA and various things. And we can say the same at a national level. President Mbeki, just when he spoke a few days ago on his reflections of the 30 years, he reminded us when he got into his office, there was just a desk and a chair. There was nothing more. So we've built, we've set things up. And the issue is that, and again, let me quote Professor Adebayo Adedeji. He says sometimes, it may even have been President Mbeki, I better not confuse the two of them, but he said sometimes democracy creates discontinuity. And the sad challenge was that the discontinuity was not change of party, but in change of administrations, and I'm talking about executives. But this is where public servants decide that they want to play politics with a small p. Because the Constitution is very clear about the role of public servants. And Chapter 10 of the Constitution, Section 195, very clearly spells out the values and principles that public servants should be subjected to. So when you talk about the absence of service delivery, you must ask yourself, so the largest engine that's supposed to deliver this, with 1 million plus public servants, when I was there it was 1.3, what are they doing?
But you also know from the whistleblowers that it's difficult for them. They're strong-armed. We have a number of whistleblowers who tell you that it's not them necessarily. And that's not to say they're not guilty of being party agents, but there is an interaction there that I think you can't necessarily say that they want to play politics without being coerced into playing politics.
So there's two things I want to say to that. Very clearly, as a public servant, you have an obligation and responsibility. So even that one who wants to coerce the public servant, I assume it's another public servant, unless the minister is reaching out directly. And if that's the case, that's both a breach of the Constitution as well as the regulatory environment. There's a very clear regulatory environment, but it means that there's been a breakdown around accountability.
Yes.
And the Public Service Commission should come into play, because at the end of the day, I mean, whistleblowing should also go to the Public Service Commission, and we investigated instances of whistleblowing and followed through. And there were instances when we put provinces or specific departments under management. We did that with correctional services in the early 2000s.
Thank you so much for staying with us. Busi, you've been very patient with us. Good evening and welcome. Busi is a social justice activist, she says. Good evening and welcome, Busi. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. My question is particularly around service delivery and, understanding that the democratic government inherited a poorly trained and racially skewed public service. That's something that we definitely understand and we can all agree to, which is also characterized by mostly poorly trained public servants. Also looking at the fact that public servants had to work through, a developmental state while also upholding the constitutional values and principles that underpin public administration. What we're finding to be a particular crisis at the moment is the fact that, there seems to be an orgy of corruption and unprofessional behavior that is, being underplayed within public administration and in the public sector as well. And we're seeing this through, cadre deployment, which we're using and we've adopted as South Africans in our public sector, which leaves a lot to be desired. Now, my particular question is centered around whether we need to start looking at the modernization of the model state for more bureaucracy, considering that it's an ongoing challenge. So I want to know what, the opinion is, particularly around the clarion call that remains for the public service to move to a more professional and ethos-based public service that serves the public. Because at the moment, there are many unanswered questions that remain as to whether we're going to move towards a new managerialist model supported by the country's RDP. So there's a lot of issues when it comes to effective service delivery that people aren't able to access because of the unprofessionalism that is within government departments and in specific sectors of our society? And how exactly are we going to move forward going into the 7th administration in government post the national elections, considering the fact that public administration plays a key role in service delivery, and we're seeing this orgy that is happening around corruption within that particular environment?
Thanks, Busi.
Thank you very much, Busi. Thanks for your questions. And I'm going to try and deal with it because you've raised a number of questions. Busi, clearly you have quite a great interest in looking at the public service, obviously looking at state building and all that. And I'd suggest that you go back and look at my parliamentary statements that were made almost every year from 1999, and we dealt with these very issues. We looked at the issue of public servants serving. And I think it's not correct to say that all, or suggest, and I know you're generalizing, that all public servants are poorly trained. There are some very, very good public servants. And I think what we've done is also ensured at the time when we were in government in the first 15 years, and I hope some of that is still continuing, that there were strong links with the university, with schools of public administration, and we also now have the National School of Public Administration that's within the state. It was called SAMDI at some point, given different names, and this looked at training of public servants. And so I'd want to raise that point. The second point I want to make on cadre deployment, it's not a policy adopted by the public service, and you shouldn't get that wrong. And I also want to say there's nothing wrong with cadre deployment. You have one or other form of that all over the world. It was where there was a deviation and quite a distortion, because I think what you don't want is you don't want underqualified people in jobs. You don't want people who don't have the competencies that are required. You don't want the situation of someone coming in there appointed for whatever nefarious reasons. And in any event, when people were appointed, and even when there was deployment, they went through a rigorous interview process. So let me tell you that the appointment of director generals and deputy director generals, even down to, well, at those two levels, we had panels that included ministers and the Public Service Commission. They had to go through a process. We felt that one thing that we had scrapped, that we felt should be reintroduced, is the issue of anyone coming into the public service going through an exam, so that you know that people who come in are qualified for the roles they come into. You may be surprised as well that there are a number of younger people in the public service. In recent times, I had reason to look at the breakdown of statistics, and it's not only older public servants, but you also need a very good mix that takes into account experience. The last point, be careful of the managerialist model. You can't run the public service like a business. You've got to run it efficiently and effectively. But look, at the end of the day, the managers work according to targets. And if you are, let's put it this way, if you're in the health sector and maybe you're involved in counseling, if I'm simply going to demand a head count, so if you are simply going to be measured on the number of people you see, You may only see people for 10 minutes when you may have a case that requires a lot more time. So you've got to look at different measures of accountability.
Yeah.
And remember, the private sector only reaches a very small segment of the population. The public sector must reach everyone who cannot pay for the service, as you and I don't know, Busi, in terms of your circumstance, so how do we do it? But what we must demand, and what we were working towards and are still hoping to achieve, is a functioning public health system, a functioning education system. The police services and defense is outside, is not counted narrowly in the public service, but they must also carry out their responsibilities effectively. So in all sectors, and then the administration itself must function in a manner where they understand they serve the public. Because as we said when we were in government, and I'm sure you know that Batupile is a call for serving people. It's been there as part of our democracy. And part of Batupile is ensuring that we serve, and we serve with distinction, and that you don't come to a place and somebody says, well, it's tea time now, I'm shutting down, I'm sorry, I can't help you. And remember, public services must be accessible through a single window. So it doesn't matter if I'm local government, provincial or national. And mind you, we have service delivery centers, and one of them are in Maponya Mall. And this has come about way back, and it's still functioning, where you're able to get services from Home Affairs. You can get access to information around, social grants or various others. People must come to one window and they must get responses.
My next question will require a bit of time, but let's try. Inequality means at some point there are things, with all these wonderful policies, there are things we're not getting right. What are those things?
We are quite a deeply unequal society. And as has been pointed out, we were able to get the economy growing in the first 15 years. We were able to ensure that we generated jobs at a level that was not there before 1994. We also looked very much at the provision of infrastructure projects that could make a difference, and make a difference around job creation for people in the country. The challenge that we've had, and we need to look at how to overcome it, and I'm not going to answer it comprehensively, so I'll just lift particular issues. So let's talk about education. And if you look at the National Development Plan, there's a particular target where we had said we'd like to have 100 PhDs per, million of our population by, I think it is 2030.
2030.
That's what the number is. 2030. At the moment, if you look at where we are at on that target, it's below 1%. And to a large degree, when we look at that number and you look at specific types of PhDs, it's also because you are saying that these people will help generate knowledge and ensure that we become more innovative as a country around economic development and job creation. And I think we've fallen short, but we must bear in mind that we were also impacted upon by exogenous factors like the 2008 global economic downturn. There has been various complexities, but I think more needs to be done in order to look at how best we can grow our economy and grow jobs. And I think that is one of the areas to overcome inequality in our society. And this is going to require government working together with the private sector and civil society, particularly organized labor, in this regard. And there has been various initiatives that the incumbent government has worked on around social compacting. But I think, again, when you look at it, because there were fairly detailed plans developed by the private sector. Now, I am serving on the board of a listed company in the mining sector, and I'm aware through serving on that board that there were very detailed plans developed through the Minerals Council, where the mining sector made a contribution and said, these are the areas we want to develop. And of course, without any surprise, I mean, of interest for the larger economy is for us to get the infrastructure right, and this is rail, because we need to get goods to ports. And infrastructure is also looking at our harbours and all that type of thing. We look at the issue of energy. Now, very quickly back to the private sector, and again, talking about mining, at that point, the Minerals Council were ready and stated they were putting quite a large amount on the table to match whatever would come from the fiscus, not to match it, but a percentage thereof. And I think there was an amount from the private sector as a whole, and I stand to be corrected, of about 3 billion rand being invested from the side of the private sector. That initiative is being revived. We also know that in the early years, the private sector held back domestic private sector from investing into the domestic economy. So I think we shouldn't only blame government.
Absolutely.
For this. It's both.
To a large extent, still holding back.
Yes, and they're still holding back, and they've got to do that, because at the end of the day, if we want foreign direct investment, we've got to ensure that domestic capital put money in to this. So it's jobs. We've got to overcome this. We've got to get the power right, electricity. So it's very important that Eskom is sorted out, and that we look, much as we may want to look at a diversified energy plan. I mean, at this point in time, we need, for any huge infrastructure project, you need energy.
Oh. So for that young lady who refused to stand up in the front of the bus seats in Cape Town, and was kicked out of the bus and had to walk to school, of course somebody came to assist. For that young lady, the activist that you were at a very young age, are you optimistic?
I've got to be. As Antonio Gramsci says, you may have the pessimism of the intellect, but you must have the optimism of the will. And I'll never lose that. And no South African must lose that. Because at the end of the day, we must fix this together.
Well, I really appreciate you coming through. Really appreciate it. You are listening to a conversation I was having, which will be on podcast, to Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi. And as I said, it will be available as a podcast in a few minutes. In fact, I think it's already up there. Thanks very much for coming through.
Thank you. And thanks for the show this evening. It was enjoyable, I think.
Just like that. It went just like that. 6 minutes after 9.